again, going back to that example of CryptoVoxels, all the CryptoVoxels guy has to build is just this virtual world, and he leaves all of these pieces out to other people, and those companies compete against each other to provide the best services in each category. So we compete against other marketplaces to provide the best marketplace. Wallets compete to provide the best wallet. So ultimately, still super early days for all this stuff. And as a user, it's like confusing as hell, because you're like, what thing do I use for what purpose? And like, how do I like, that's the negative piece of all this unbundling. But the positive is that you get that competition.
Layer 1 is a podcast and community dedicated to helping you master all things crypto. We'll be bringing you the best interviews with project executives, technical analysis for trading of the most popular cryptocurrencies, and insight into what's actually happening behind the scenes.
As you join us each episode, you're going to hear about tokens, fundraisers, investments, and even crypto conspiracies. But please remember that nothing we say should be considered financial or legal advice.
Come join us on this journey, and welcome to Layer 1.
Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, all of you out there, it's now post-halving, but we are still rocking and rolling as always. Another episode of the Layer 1 podcast. It's, goodness, I guess May 12th here as we're recording this episode. Before we introduce our guest, as always, I've got to kick it over to Q. Q, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great. It's a post-halving kind of hangover day. We don't know what to talk about anymore, but we are going to talk about something that's an industry that's pretty up and coming, the NFT industry. We've got Devin Finzer from OpenSea. We are going to have a great conversation, man. I brought my Pittsburgh jersey out as well in solidarity with your Pens jersey. So happy to do that. But we have Devin Finzer, as I said, from OpenSea. Devin, how are you doing on this Tuesday, May 12th?
Doing pretty well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, where are you at right now? You said you were in San Fran, correct? But you're also located in New York City?
Right. So normally I'm located in New York City. I am in the East Bay, so right near San Francisco in the suburbs.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we promise not to ask you too many COVID questions. We want to stay specifically on OpenSea. But before we get there, let's talk about your background, how you kind of got into crypto, that typical growing up and maybe finding tech story. I would love to hear how you came to find crypto.
Sure. So I have always worked in tech. I worked at Pinterest right after I graduated from college. So kind of got accustomed with Silicon Valley tech culture. Got really excited about the things that were happening. Was working on the growth team, so I kind of saw Pinterest evolve from 200, 300 person company all the way to now it's IPO. I wasn't there for the IPO, but kind of saw it grow quite a lot. I had followed kind of Bitcoin peripherally, but I was never super deep into it until around mid 2017, when it was kind of the talk of the town. Everyone was in Silicon Valley was just fascinated by what was happening, right? And so I at the time I was kind of looking for something that was outside of more of the traditional mature startup space and a little more frontier technology. And the frontier technologies that were super interesting at the time were number one, cryptocurrency, number two, AI, virtual reality, and then genomics as well. And crypto really seemed like the one area that was really fundamentally disruptive to larger players in tech. Because if you look at virtual reality and AI, the existing players are actually pretty well positioned to capitalize on those technologies, versus crypto is like just a fundamentally different model of how we interact with personal data. And so it seemed like it was very ripe for startups. So I just kind of went down the rabbit hole from there, as a lot of folks did, and got interested in sort of the non-financial part of crypto, which at the time was really just CryptoKitties. So it's kind of the first more mainstream oriented application that wasn't all about trading and finance, which is obviously a huge important part of what crypto is. But I think we're now starting to see that there's this whole unexplored territory of the of more of the gaming utility use cases for blockchain.
Yeah, I think most people that have been around since 2017 know about CryptoKitties. It's very played out at this point. At just someone starting a conversation. Hey, do you remember CryptoKitties? And down the NFT rabbit hole you go. But take us through your kind of process or your thought process as CryptoKitties launched, and what you were thinking about all the ideas and all the future iterations that could be created, because you guys have now essentially created one of the best, if not, I wouldn't say the only functioning one, but definitely the best NFT marketplace. So take us through your thought process there as CryptoKitties was kind of exploding, and what your thoughts were there.
Yeah, at a high level, I think our thought process was actually pretty simplistic. Like, it was just kind of bizarre that people were trading cats for hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? That's just like a crazy phenomenon. And whenever you see something kind of like crazy like that, it's indicative of sometimes indicative of nothing, like the tulip bubble, for example, right? But it's sometimes indicative of a really interesting, like, long-term trend, right? When these really weird things happen, and Bitcoin being the greatest example, was kind of this like really bizarre thing. There was a Magic the Gathering exchange that was allowing people to trade Bitcoin Mt. Gox, right? And so if you see that kind of like weird activity happening, it's usually indicative that there's something really interesting going on. So it was really just that sort of sparked our interest. And then as we dug deeper, I think one of the really interesting things about CryptoKitties was when you looked beyond just the speculative CryptoKitties bubble, there were these really interesting kind of trends that intersected with gaming. So one of those was sort of the unbundling of the gaming items from the gaming experience, right? So you could have the game items exist outside of the original application that they were born in. So in the case of CryptoKitties, right after CryptoKitties had its big moment, there were all of these little companion applications that were built on top of CryptoKitties. So there was Kitty Racing, which allowed you to take your CryptoKitties and race them against each other. There was Kitty Hats, which allowed you to add accessories to your CryptoKitties. And for us, the exciting thing was you could now have your CryptoKitties live in this open marketplace, and other things like CryptoKitties could live in this open marketplace and be traded outside of the original experience. So that was kind of that first like spark of what was an interesting trend beyond just the fact that there was this really exciting like speculation as the first use case for these assets.
Yeah, it was wild back in the day. That 2017, early 2018 time. We talk about it a lot, but as somebody who is a bit closer to Silicon Valley maybe than we are, you did mention that a lot of folks back then were just kind of dominated by the crypto hype that was going on. Obviously, it's been a chaotic year for Bitcoin thus far, but there are kind of some bigger macro trends that are happening. Just, real quick before we dive deeper into OpenSea a little bit here, what are kind of the differences that you're seeing between now and, like I said, this interesting macro backdrop versus 2017 and early 2018 when the crypto wave really first kind of hit the shores?
So I think the biggest difference is kind of the profile of the companies that are working in the space is much more focused on leanness and building and shipping product, right? So if you look at the NFT space, because there's not the same sort of wave of ICO speculation, the companies are raising smaller seed rounds. They're sort of testing product market fit. They're going to market early, and they're interacting with users. And now while the number of users in the space is still pretty small, there's this kind of early group of passionate early adopters on which you can start to sort of test these ideas with. So I think it's sort of back to startup fundamentals in some ways, where you with a typical startup, you don't necessarily start with or you have a vision, but you have more than just a vision, right? You have a product, and you're testing hypotheses, and you're sort of figuring out how that vision makes it into the real world. Versus, I think, with the ICO type environment, you kind of just had that vision, and then there was enough of this speculative environment to raise a lot of money off of that. So I think it's an exciting time to be in the space because a lot of the noise is gone, and it's really just people who are in it for the long term, who are really excited about the technology, but then are also trying to make real businesses that work.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, really, I think what you're getting at there is that 2017 was dominated by this influx of speculators, and some have remained, and many have left because they got burned on ICOs or on Bitcoin or whatnot. But hopefully, as we move forward and as we have, as you said, these really awesome hands-on products that people can use, maybe they come in at first via speculation, but then stick around for a lot of these products that are being built, whether they're in the gaming space or financial space. So that's awesome to hear, firsthand from you and what you're seeing today. But moving on to OpenSea, right? So OpenSea is a bit newer compared to some other projects, and obviously it's in a niche within crypto that is a little newer. So maybe to start, if you can kind of just real briefly go over the concept of an NFT and then how OpenSea fits into the NFT and the crypto landscape.
Sure. So an NFT stands for non-fungible token. And if you think about currencies, basically a currency is kind of interchangeable with itself. It doesn't really matter like which Bitcoin I own. It's always worth the amount of a Bitcoin, no matter if it's this Bitcoin or that Bitcoin. But interestingly enough, most stuff in the real world and the digital world is actually not currencies or not fungible assets. It's actually typically each thing is unique, right? So if you have an item inside of a game, usually you just have this one item, and or a piece of art, you just have a single piece of art. A chair, for example, is not. It's sort of fungible with chairs of the same type of chair, but for the most part, each thing is unique. So it's kind of interesting that the first use cases for blockchain were actually currencies versus just other sorts of unique digital assets, because the sort of diversity of the latter is actually quite large. So OpenSea is basically a place where you can go and trade all of these types of assets. And instead of looking like an exchange like Coinbase, where you trade currencies, it looks more like a marketplace, like something like eBay, because that's the typical type of interface that people are used to when they're buying and selling these unique digital assets.
Yeah, I think a lot of us in the gaming world that have come up through games like RuneScape and World of Warcraft understand the point of digital items kind of being valuable to the person, right? But not being at all non-fungible in these types of games that are controlled by different entities like Blizzard and things like that. So we definitely get that. It's tough to kind of explain an NFT to maybe a user that is just kind of wrapping their head around Bitcoin and the concept, like you're saying, of fungible tokens. So what's the plan for OpenSea going forward? I know you guys launched, I think, in 2018, I'm guessing. Was it early 2018?
Yeah, early 2018. Yep.
So what's the plan for OpenSea going forward? Because I know you guys also have kind of a white label merchant market. Like, I guess a merchant can come to you and say, I want to build this marketplace myself and have it all customizable so that my users can go there. But you also have that peer-to-peer marketplace. So what's the plan with OpenSea going forward?
Yeah, so right now we're kind of a hybrid, as you mentioned. We have this eBay style site where anyone can come and sell their stuff, and it's OpenSea.io, and you can filter into different categories, search for things, all of that. But then we also do work with a lot of partners on building slightly more customized versions of that. I would say right now our strategy is it's just a mixture of both. The space is early enough that we think probably the most important thing for our growth is the growth of the entire non-fungible token space of basically developers building interesting projects using non-fungible tokens and blockchain technology. Like that's really like our goal over the next couple of years is just help grow the space and kind of grow alongside it. And so to that end, we provide kind of a spectrum of tools. If you just want to, if maybe even if you're not technical and you just want to create a digital item and sell it to your fans, you can go on OpenSea and do that pretty easily. If you're a game and you want to use OpenSea as your marketplace, you don't want to build your own, you can do that pretty easily. And then if you're a medium to large game and you want kind of a customized look and feel of your marketplace, but you want to power it with existing smart contracts that have been battle tested, then we provide the tools to do that as well. So it's really a combination of all of those strategies, and they actually kind of fit well with each other, because a lot of times what these games and projects want is to plug into the audience that we've amassed through all of the partners that we've worked with over time. So there's now a very passionate set of early adopters on OpenSea who are kind of constantly looking for new things to purchase, new things to try, and being able to plug into that ecosystem has been pretty valuable for new projects that are launching.
Yeah, I feel like we're going to continuously jump in and out of maybe non-technical things around NFTs, as well as like maybe more in-depth conversations. So for the more avid NFT user, what is your data showing you on your marketplace, and kind of what you're seeing just being heads down in the NFT industry? What is the data telling you about, the different games that have been popular, where the most users are coming from, maybe even data on your users, what they're doing? Just for the more avid NFT user, what's happening in the NFT space as you see it?
Yeah, I would break down the different sort of categories of use cases with as the following. The first is kind of the gaming use case, and in that use case, the biggest category we're seeing right now is virtual worlds. So these are kind of the foundational layer for real estate that can be built on top of inside of a virtual environment. So a great example is Decentraland, which is basically this giant virtual world. You can own land. The land is actually relatively expensive, and you can build a nightclub on that piece of land, or a museum. And that's a pretty interesting sort of foundational layer on which other sorts of projects, for example, like an art project, can come in and display their art inside of this museum. And so that's where we're seeing the most volume. Another couple of projects in that space are CryptoVoxels, the Sandbox, Insomnium space, and they're all trying to create these foundational layers. The other within gaming, the other category is card games. So I don't know if either of you ever played Magic the Gathering back in the day, but with Magic the Gathering, you had both the card game that you could play with your friends, but you also had an entire economy around the cards. So you had dozens of different sites where you could buy and sell Magic cards. Of course, eBay was the largest one, and there were people who were basically sort of miniature investors in Magic cards. So now you can have that with open markets. You can kind of have that same phenomenon where you have a really fun game around the cards, but you also have an open economy. So we're seeing a lot of experimentation in that space with Gods Unchained, Skyweaver, and then a host of other card games launching as well. So that's gaming.
Devin, before you go on, what elemental deck were you in Magic the Gathering? If you're a Magic the Gathering player.
I was a very casual Magic the Gathering player, so I didn't have Forest was one of the decks, right?
Okay.
I played. I was terrible.
I got you.
Were you good at it?
I was not good. I would like to think I was good, but I was just dabbled as well. Sorry for interrupting you, but I thought that would be some good information. So you were
Forest is legitimate, right? That's an element.
I think so. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes sense. We'll go with it. We'll run with
it. The green one. But I did. I mean, it was really fun. I would never got to the level where I was doing any sophisticated deck building. So yeah, that's kind of the gaming space, and there's a whole host of other sorts of games as well, including games where they're bringing traditional IP. So, for example, Formula One just partnered with a company to launch a Formula One racing car game, and MLB has done stuff. So traditional IP is really interested in these sort of collectible type games. So a lot of stuff happening there. The second category is that we're seeing of interest is domain names. So these are basically fall under a couple of categories. One is just a human readable address for your Ethereum hexadecimal address. So the Ethereum name service is basically allowing you to create Devin.eth, and then instead of sending things to 0x ABCDEF, you send it to Devin.eth, and then you can also host content on Devin.eth, and there's a lot of pieces that need to come together for that to work well, but we're sort of seeing a lot of kind of early excitement around investing in those types of names. And then the third category is this digital art space, and there that's one that's been pretty exciting over the last 6 months. We've seen significant growth in just this idea that a creator can create a unique digital asset that has the provenance associated with that individual, and then their fans and people excited about that art can go and purchase it and support that creator. And then if they want to resell it, that's easy to do because these open markets exist. And then that kind of has this nice, as I was mentioning, interplay with the virtual world type of things, where if you have this digital art, you kind of need somewhere to show it off, right? If it's physical art, you can show it off in your room, but where do you show off your digital art? And that's where sort of the growth of these virtual worlds is very complementary to the emerging set of crypto artists that are trying this out.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. I think that was a good overview of kind of where the NFT space is heading, and the digital art one is really cool. I had the pleasure of seeing some Banksy, art, kind of street art in person earlier this year, and it's so cool. Like I could see artists like a Banksy hopping over and doing this, and you can kind of see where that would go and how it would bring in users who maybe aren't necessarily involved in crypto or really understand what it is. So kind of, maybe not the art example, but just broadly, right? If we take a step back and we look at NFTs versus a lot of the other projects in the space, I think that NFTs and any sort of application layer project have an advantage in that they're really touching the end user with meaning, right? There's an end goal there, whether it's a game or the ability to own some cool piece of digital art or a game item, right? Things like this versus a protocol token where, most of these smart contract Ethereum competitors have come out and basically said, well, our tech is this much better, and thus all of these application layer projects are going to move over to our chain, and that's why the protocol layer token is going to be valuable. And as we've seen, ETH has really dominated. So I think that these application layer projects, these NFTs in particular, are in an interesting space here, where they might be the way that users, mainstream folks who are into gaming but not into crypto, into art but not into crypto, into collecting whatever that move into crypto this way. But I think really it's kind of this chicken and the egg scenario, right? Where in order for, say, like a Decentraland's land to be valuable, you have to have users obviously coming in and purchasing the land and doing cool things on it. So understanding that chicken and the egg scenario is occurring in a lot of these, is there anything that you look at as like a really big need that the NFT space has? Meaning that if that occurred, if there was some solution for that, or the kind of metaphorical chasm was crossed, we would see NFTs really start to boom?
It's a good question. I think based on what we're seeing, it's pretty diverse. But I guess what I would say is there's sort of a developer value proposition that's emerging. So with an NFT, like let's take CryptoKitties, for example. With CryptoKitties, there wasn't really anything that the blockchain, or there wasn't really an immediate value add to blockchain. Like they basically had to create everything from scratch. They had to create the NFTs, they invented the standard, they created the marketplace, they created their website, they created all of the logic for the NFTs, and then they launched this thing. And then because it was so new and exciting, people were kind of investing in it. And you had these really interesting economic dynamics. What I think, but technically, like you kind of could have built the same CryptoKitties experience without any of that underlying like blockchain tech. You could have just said, like from an end user perspective, it's annoying that you have to use MetaMask, but you could have just bought something with ETH and it wasn't actually an NFT, right? And so the question is like, why build an NFT instead of just a traditional digital asset? And I think the answer is sort of like the infrastructure and ecosystem you get around building an NFT is very different than building a sort of centralized digital asset. So as a great example, there was a project, or there's a project called CryptoVoxels, which was one of those virtual world projects that I mentioned. And what was interesting about that is it started out as just one developer, and he basically came on to OpenSea and started selling this virtual land. And he didn't have to make a marketplace for selling it. He just went on and like created these non-fungible tokens, started selling them, for 0.2 or 0.3 ETH. People bought them, and then he focused on his application, which was this little like virtual world where it's kind of like Minecraft, you can build little things. And then, 6 months later, he's continuing to release all this land. There's this vibrant kind of trading community of folks buying and selling it. And he has this entire economy around the land, where now I think the cheapest land is 2 or 3 ETH. And we recently had a bundle of land sell for $100,000 on OpenSea. And so he's created this entire economy without having to actually create anything. All he's done is create his virtual world. He hasn't had to worry about payments. He hasn't had to worry about Stripe. He hasn't had to worry about wallets. I mean, he has to integrate with wallets, but right. All of this kind of infrastructure around it, makes it so that one developer can actually create this entire economy. So I think that's kind of what's empowering about it is that instead of having, if you didn't have blockchain involved, you would have to reinvent the wheel in like 5 different areas, versus with sort of the blockchain infrastructure, you get a lot of that for free. So I think it's less of a concrete value prop, unfortunately, than like, a typical startup where it's like, I want to buy sunglasses. So the startup like provides really good sunglasses that work in this specific way. It's a little more nebulous, but that's kind of what I see is really interesting, is that you're able to launch these new projects with much less overhead and much less cost. And so you can have these like really interesting experiments launch a lot more quickly.
That makes sense. And, OpenSea is being that marketplace is very important, right? And as I kind of look out, my question to you, I guess, would be, is there any concern that speculation, just as it occurred with ICOs, kind of takes over? And every time a brand new metaverse comes out and it's selling for 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.3 ETH, everybody kind of buys it up and is less focused about actually going in and participating in the metaverse, but more interested in flipping the land. So, like I said, is there any concern there from you or from others at OpenSea that this maybe gets too big too fast and the hype grows too fast and becomes something that actually hurts NFTs and the growth of them in the future?
Yeah, it's possible. I think I don't think we'll see as much of a crazy sort of speculative phenomenon with such a lack of fundamentals as we saw with ICOs. First of all, just because I think we've sort of had that play out, right? If some kind of virtual land project wants to do something highly speculative, they could go and try to launch an ICO for tokens, and probably these days very few people would buy into it because we kind of see that, and unless we see like another huge bull run in crypto in general, in which case that could happen. Versus I think NFTs kind of have to be a little more. There's a lot more thought that has to go into it, and a lot more kind of immediate utility and value of the asset. So for example, like the central land, there's this entire map of land and you buy specific plots of land. You're not just buying a token. There's sort of provenance and utility associated with tokens from the get-go to some extent.
Mhm.
So I mean, I could see like a lot of companies these days are talking about kind of tokenizing, for example, like rare physical collectibles, like shoes branded from like a particular artist or something like that, right? And if you have these liquid markets, certainly speculation becomes a bigger part of it. So you're right, like we haven't seen that sort of phenomenon play out quite yet, at least in terms of the magnitude that
Mm.
we saw with ICOs, but it's possible it might happen.
Yeah, I think there's a good metaphor that you could possibly make with like these protocols, Mike, where like if you increase the composability on these different platforms, you actually like increase the amount of like stickiness that maybe your different metaverse has. So the more things that are being built within CryptoVoxels, the less likely there is to be like something that supplants you. And I will say, like, I'm super bullish on NFTs. I'll tell this story real quick. We took place in the Sandbox land sale, and they had some like issues with their sale on the front end. So it was really funny. Like some things were popping up on their front end, but people weren't actually getting their land. So I actually was there looking at the land on the front end of their website, and also going to OpenSea at the same time, checking to see if my stuff was in my wallet. It was just a funny situation, and we have taken some land parcels in CryptoVoxels as well. That being said, I do have two concerns with NFTs, and I guess my first, you guys kind of touched on there with this economy and the speculation around it, and that the speculation is a little bit driven by like very small amount of users with a lot of ETH that have gained their kind of nouveau reach through the ETH ICO. That kind of concerns me, right? Because what happens when that money is maybe dried up or like hard in assets and not liquid within ETH? Are there new users coming in that are actually like adding liquidity to this kind of economy? And then the other thing is, and it's a funny conundrum, is that NFTs are like digital assets. They're kind of like Web3. They've got that Web3 vibe, right? But they're all on Web2 applications, right? Like if you are on CryptoKitties and the average user goes on CryptoKitties, yeah, they have MetaMask and they have it in their wallet. But if that CryptoKitties site went down, there's no real way that user would be able to interact with their CryptoKitty. And those things really concern me. The one being that the economy is propped up by whales, and then two, how do we make it so these decentralized assets are actually like not on centralized platforms? Is that even an issue to you? So I'll kind of throw those two arguments your way and see what you think about them.
Yeah. Well, with the second argument, so yeah, I do think that's definitely a pretty interesting piece of it. And I think, so what we're kind of seeing right now is that we sort of have this like loose social consensus around like these assets. So, your point around if CryptoKitties went down, you can interact with them. That's true. But you'd be able to interact with them kind of on a basic level on something like OpenSea or whatever other marketplaces. So they're all kind of reading from the same database and then replicating the data in this centralized fashion. Just for pragmatic purposes, right? Because it's really hard to run a website entirely based on decentralized technology. And I also think that that's going to be the practical reality for, the next 5 to 10 years. Maybe that's a little bit too pessimistic, but I think like fully unstoppable web applications that have real interesting functionality, like games, for example, you do need some element of a centralized server. And I think that's just kind of like the reality of it at the moment. And ultimately, like, when you think about a project like CryptoVoxels, part of what you're investing in with CryptoVoxels is the team itself, right? Like the fact that, the team is going to continue developing CryptoVoxels and continuing adding features to this world. And that's a centralized point of failure in itself, right? Even if CryptoVoxels was on a decentralized, website or what have you, you still need people to actually develop the features, and those can always go down, right? Like those can always stop working on it. And so I think there's always going to be, I don't know if I would call it like a centralized failure point, but there's always sort of some social elements to whether these assets are valuable or not. And I think having better technology for hosting them in decentralized ways is definitely going to help the space, but I don't see it as a deal breaker, I guess is what I would say. And then to the first point around a lot of kind of the space being driven by people who were involved in the Ethereum ICO and that kind of propping up prices, I do think that that's a big problem. And I think it's, you know, part of the reason that some of these markets aren't able to appeal to more of a mainstream user who maybe doesn't have that much money to invest in a CryptoVoxels or Decentraland parcel, right? Like that makes these projects very inaccessible. I think developers will have to get clever around how they build these economies to be more available to regular users and there's going to be tough trade-offs. So in CryptoVoxels, for example, there's this trade-off between kind of keeping the supply limited and ensuring that the people who did invest early, have a degree of scarcity around their assets. And then on the other side, expanding the universe so that you can have cheaper real estate for newer users. So I think it's kind of something that has to be dealt with on a per project basis. But I do agree that it's definitely like a challenge for the space. But
yeah,
go ahead. I said I don't think that means that there's not an opportunity to expand. It just means that like there's a lot of economic challenges that the current projects that relied on that have to face.
That's a really interesting thought, because when I kind of posed the question to you there, it was more towards like kind of the viability of the NFT space in general to bring in new users. But what you're saying is actually the whales are keeping out the new users because they're driving up prices so high because they're willing to spend so much on these different assets. I didn't look at it in that sense. So speaking of whales, I do have a question about this WhaleShark guy. I don't know if he obviously is trading. I don't know if he is trading on your platform. Maybe he goes directly to the source. But WhaleShark is essentially probably the biggest NFT user within the entire industry. He's amassed like 3,000, I think, NFTs, and he's now created this currency backed by a vault of those NFTs. We also had Alex Masmej on, who created RocketNFT, which are NFT-backed loans. I wonder what you think about these two individuals and what they're iterating on with NFTs.
So I'm not as knowledgeable about I am familiar with WhaleShark, but I'm not, I haven't looked in depth into exactly how everything works. So just that as a caveat. But overall, I would say I think it's super interesting. I think I guess I've heard some complaints from other like mini whales that he, basically buys out all this stuff and then they can't get their hands on some of this stuff. So maybe that's one kind of issue, but overall, I think like experimentation with those types of things is super cool. The RocketNFT stuff I haven't followed super recently, but I think at some point there's going to be an NFT that it becomes viable for using as collateral for a loan. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, or I'm not sure if that's going to kind of scale within the short-term time horizon, but I do think at some point that's going to be a super interesting use case. So I think all of these kind of, it really comes back to this point of you can build, it's same as DeFi, where you can build all these kind of pieces of it with the existing building blocks, and those start to add up significantly over time and build a network effect, right? So now if you have an ability to do lending on top of NFTs, there's even more of a value prop for a new developer who's considering building their digital assets as an NFT versus just a centralized digital asset. So all of these experiments, I think, are super cool.
Yeah, and that's really been a kind of a mantra of ETH, or really a sticking point for ETH, is that you have so many different talents, so many different developers, so many different enthusiasts and project owners like yourself who are out here kind of experimenting at the bleeding edge within an industry that's already bleeding edge. And they've gotten a lot of growth just out of that kind of that pure fact. So having started in early 2018, What has the process been really joining the ETH ecosystem? I'm not sure, how deep of a developer you are, but obviously everybody points to ETH as kind of the place with all the crypto developers, right? The place who has the giant ecosystem for anybody who wants to come and build something, come in and try something new. So somebody on the inside, right? What does kind of the ecosystem look like today, and how has that changed since that early 2018 time?
Yeah, I think it's continued to. I think it's become more and more vibrant. I mean, certainly the like biggest focus of the space has been DeFi by far, right? So that's where you have these kind of successful, what you can call successful projects, right? Like MakerDAO, Uniswap, Compound, that are doing very interesting real things with, I guess, still with small user bases and still kind of confined to these crypto early adopters, but they've accomplished a lot, right? Like the fact that there's now a stablecoin, a decentralized stablecoin available on Ethereum that we can use for buying and selling NFTs is huge. And I think there's I would say the kind of culture of the Ethereum community is a combination of these really interesting sort of lean DeFi startups where they're a legitimate startup. They raise money around their idea, and so they are trying to figure out business model and future of governance of the project. Or there's all these kind of open questions around how these startups are going to work, and then just a lot of people who aren't working for companies and just are going to a lot of hackathons and building really cool stuff and exploring. So it's kind of this mishmash of some really cool startups, some folks who are dabbling, and then maybe we'll start a company down the road. And I think it's this sort of perfect kind of Cambrian explosion of just ideas, and that's a really exciting ecosystem to be part of. I'm not sure, I haven't personally attended a lot of other layer one type meetups, so I'm pretty sort of biased in my perspective, but I think what's cool about Ethereum is that even if it doesn't end up being the place for all of these applications, it's at least a taste of what's interesting, right? It's a playground for all of this stuff, and then I think these other layer one solutions can learn a lot from that, so that as the space expands, they kind of make sure that they're building in the right way, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, really, I think what you're getting at is this really wild evolution that happens. I think most folks come into the space and they come in hearing at some point, right? Some point between, say, 2011 and now, all about Bitcoin, right? Or all about Ethereum, or all about, some other kind of project in the space that maybe a friend of theirs made a bunch of money on, and they jump in and they buy a little bit and kind of mess around and hopefully learn about it. And, a small handful, as you've said, kind of go on to maybe make a little money in the space, start a business in the space. Some are very successful, others don't work out. But then, that group of kind of your speculative first folks, right? They exist on one side of the coin, if you will. And then on the other side, you have this developer base, right? And I think there are so many different projects in the space now that it almost feels like the supply of projects and the supply of ideas outstrips the available talent when it comes to developing on these various blockchain projects. So, this is, again, is kind of off topic. It's not directly related to OpenSea, but, based on your context, based on your experience, my question would be, do you still see a ton of, new developers coming into the space, say in the same way that a lot of the financial first companies like your BlockFis or some of these that are interacting within, crypto finance, they're seeing a lot of bankers come in, right? There's dozens of different ex-Goldman folks that have now merged over to crypto. So are we seeing that still on the development side? Has it slowed? Has it picked up?
Yeah, hard for me to say concretely with any rigorous data. I would say my sense is that it's continuing to grow. I think if you look at DevCon each year, which I believe has a cap on the number of tickets. But I think from 2017 to 2018, like demand for attending DevCon, skyrocketed, at least from that period. So I think it's continuing to grow. I think the other interesting thing to mention is that as a startup, you don't necessarily need to hire from the existing crypto developer community. So as more startups come online, they kind of hire from your Facebook, your Google, your Silicon Valley startup, and that brings people in. So for example, I guess some of the folks that are on our team were already excited about this stuff, but others were just excited about software engineering, and then when they got associated with and learned about this technology, they sort of were converted into more of like a crypto engineer. So I think that's kind of the way I could see a lot of this happening, is that or I guess two areas. One is these startups hiring from outside of crypto, and the second is kind of looking at what developers are doing in their spare time. And my sense is that a lot of that crypto is kind of a ripe area for outside of work, what technology is cool enough that you're going to spend your free time on it. That's one of the kind of heuristics that or one of the indicators I think that is often used to figure out what's an actually exciting technology, because developers can be paid a lot, and so if they're voting with their time to do this, then that's probably pretty valuable.
Yeah, I think it's fair to point out a point of, it's not if the developers is building there, it's why they would want to. And I think Ethereum's done a good job of, creating that community and having that Cambrian explosion to the point where, like, besides grants, I don't see why a developer would want to go and take the risk of building on a platform that's just kind of starting out, as opposed to gaining access to the Ethereum users, like you're kind of saying there. So I guess my question here is there any plan on integrating other networks into OpenSea in the near future? Is there enough going on, like Mike's saying, on these other networks where you're going to even think about a year out? Okay, yeah, we can add maybe what's going on Tezos, or what's going on EOS, or what's going on other smart contract platforms. Maybe Tron would be a good example. We're not too big Tron maxis over here, but they certainly have things going on in the gaming and gambling sector. So what do you think about that question?
Yeah, definitely. So maybe what I was just saying gave an impression that I was sort of somewhat maximalist on Ethereum. That's not the case at all. I think at OpenSea, we definitely see ourselves as an application layer company, and we think that one of the value adds of application level companies is they can effectively abstract over underlying blockchain layers, and that's certainly something that we see ourselves doing over time, and we're already starting to put in place the infrastructure for that to happen. I think also, I think at some point there's going to be a pretty interesting question about we've already seen increases in gas prices in periods of time where gas prices are through the roof, and it's basically near impossible to use any application where you're relying on some degree of throughput on the network. And I think that's only going to get worse over time. And the question is, what exactly happens when that becomes a persistent issue on a daily basis, and OpenSea and everyone else is affected by it? Will we have layer 2 solutions like optimistic rollup that come in and save the day for developers, or will people start moving to other things? And I think I don't know the answer to that question. So we need to be fully prepared for the emergence of interesting projects on other protocols. And we've already seen projects on other protocols, EOS and Tron. But I think there's a really big opportunity for some of these competitors layer 1 competitors to sort of seize the moment, build the right sort of community and developer tools. I think a lot of projects are starting to do this in pretty interesting ways. Tezos has been working a lot on their non-fungible and fungible token standards. Near Protocol is obviously doing really interesting stuff. And so these projects are early, but I do think that they're going to capture developer mindshare when on a daily basis the network is clogged. So it'll kind of, my guess is it'll kind of come down to, are these layer 2 scaling solutions viable when that happens, or are they not?
Yeah, I appreciate your openness in answering that question. We are running up to an hour here, and those listening at home don't know this, but off camera, there's a bag of Chipotle waiting for Devin here. So I want to ask you one question before we kind of hop out and talk broadly. Oh, there it is. Yep, brought to you by Chipotle, guys. But I do have one question. I listened to a interview from like late 2018 before we hopped on this episode. But you talked about that process of unbundling and also this vertical, I don't know what the term you use, but vertical, what is it?
Integration.
Vertical integrations that maybe centralized apps in centralized games have used. I want you to break down like those vertical integrations and how they've kind of worked their way up in kind of these centralized gaming and how that changes with this unbundling, because that's like a super important process of understanding how NFTs can open up these gaming worlds. And also just like a small side question, did none of this unbundling ever occurred beforehand with any of these centralized applications? It's simply because blockchain evolved and was able to do this?
It's good. That second question is a good one. I'll have to think a little bit about that, but to explain the general idea, if you're a game developer today and you're building a centralized game, basically what you build is a lot of different pieces of the stack. So you're building your front end for the game in whatever game engine you're using. You're building a database that has the items and users and all of the sort of data of the game. And then, if you're building any sort of payment related stuff, you're either integrating with like Apple Pay, Google Pay, or Stripe, but you're building like a lot of these pieces of all the different pieces of your game, right? Now, with a blockchain game, what's really interesting is you can build a lot fewer of those pieces, and each of those pieces can kind of be built by different entities. So for example, instead of a user system that you build yourself, you just use a wallet, right? You just have people sign in with a wallet. And now the wallet space is completely, separated into tons of different wallets, right? You have MetaMask, you have Portis, Fortmatic, Bitski, Trust Wallet, Coinbase Wallet. You have like 20 or 30 different wallets. So that's like kind of an unbundling of the authentication system that you would use to use an application. Now there's all sorts of different providers, right? Similarly, when you built a game before, if you did have a marketplace, a lot of games just decided not to build marketplaces because it was too much work, but you would build it yourself, right? And you would you would use something like the Steam marketplace. And so that is kind of an area where some of these tools were like available with these existing platforms. But now what you can do is you can say, okay, I'm just going to build the assets and I'll just leave the marketplace open to like all of these free marketplaces, right? OpenSea, any OpenSea competitor. Now there can be like tens of different marketplaces where you can buy and sell these things. So that's another area where it's unbundled. And then similarly, payment. So if you're using a token on Ethereum, there's now like 10 different ways to get crypto, right? There's obviously, you can go to an exchange and get Coinbase. You can use something like Wire to allow people to buy crypto on your site. There's 5 or 6 other companies that are doing that. And so now the payment piece is not just like, you don't have to handle that yourself. You just handle whatever gets people in the crypto. So the whole thing is being broken apart, so that, again, going back to that example of CryptoVoxels, all the CryptoVoxels guy has to build is just his virtual world, and he leaves all of these pieces out to other people, and those companies compete against each other to provide the best services in each category. So we compete against other marketplaces to provide the best marketplace. Wallets compete to provide the best wallet. So ultimately, still super early days for all this stuff. And as a user, it's like confusing as hell, because you're like, what thing do I use for what purpose? And like, how do I like, you know, that's the negative piece of all this unbundling. But the positive is that you get that competition. And so ultimately, the user experience of all of these things improves. Now, in the short run, there's a lot of advantages to keeping certain things vertically integrated. So for example, you know, maybe if you're a game, you don't want to give people like the option of choosing any wallet, because it simplifies your life to give them just one wallet option. And then, you know, maybe if they want the more advanced use case, they can bring their own wallet. Or maybe it makes sense to build your own marketplace because you want that like specific user experience around the marketplace. So I'm not saying that you know, it always makes sense to unbundle everything from the beginning, and that's always going to be better. But I think that is like the opportunity that blockchain infrastructure presents.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So as we wrap up here, before we get to, you know, where folks can find more about you, where they can find more about OpenSea, I'm curious, what is really exciting in the NFT space right now to you, specifically kind of on the project front? I know looking at OpenSea, Decentraland has pretty much been the top, you know, kind of metaverse, and obviously have their various NFTs. They have their land, but is there something newer that you've been looking at, or like this could be big, or, you know, what in general is kind of exciting project wise?
Yeah, I'm excited about a lot of things, and I guess at least right now I have my bets placed on like a variety of possible killer apps or possible things that might take off versus just one. But I would say virtual land is definitely super exciting to me. Digital art is really interesting. You know, streamlining the process for artists to come on board and launch NFTs, I think is gonna kind of open the floodgates. The other area where I think a lot of interesting stuff is happening is sort of in physical assets. So providing tokenization of physical assets to kind of bootstrap the value of one of these digital tokens. So as an example, like imagine kind of, I think I mentioned this before, but tokenizing like a really valuable pair of sneakers that, you know, people are willing to spend $300 on, and now you could have that asset traded digitally many times before actually getting redeemed for the actual physical asset. So I think, and then you could have partial ownership of those, so you can, you know, buy a little piece of it without ever needing to own the sneaker, but still, you know, be invested in that product. So I think that I could see there's a couple of projects that are doing things like that, and I could see that being an interesting way to kind of bootstrap the value of these things and bring in more people who are excited about existing physical products. It's almost, I think I've heard it kind of described as like a proof of work type thing for the token, right? You're proving that there's something behind it, and maybe it doesn't really matter if that thing is never redeemed, but you could redeem it if you wanted, and so that makes the market a lot more liquid.
Got it. Yeah, I saw a tweet from somebody that. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say also, the one last thing on that is you can imagine bringing that physical asset as a token into a digital world, right? So like say I buy this rare piece of sneakers, it comes with the ability to attach it to my avatar, and now like they know that I own this rare piece of sneakers, and I can kind of show it off in this digital environment in a way that proves that I actually have purchased it.
Yeah, it's funny that we're using this example because I saw a tweet from someone in the NFT space recently where he was using his, I think it's called Avastars, one of the
Mhm.
NFTs. It was like a sneaker a voxel essentially that he actually displayed in the physical world, which is interesting because
Mm.
all we're really focused on when we're talking NFTs is like, oh, let's bring these physical items into the metaverse. Well, a lot of the metaverse items we could bring into the physical world, but we just don't really think about that in that much. So that's an interesting kind of situation where very serendipitous example that you use with a sneaker. But anyways, we're pretty much coming up to the end of it. If you have anything that you want to talk about outside of NFTs, that would be a great topic of conversation. If not, we kind of have one last question to ask you, but I do want to throw it your way. If anything in crypto outside of NFTs, maybe you know catches your eye from time to time.
Not that I can think of at the moment. Yeah. I'm always interested in the DeFi space. If you guys have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, Mike might have some good DeFi thoughts here. We've been having a lot of DeFi people here, founders of different platforms on the podcast. So what do you think, Mike?
Yeah, honestly, I've been surprised with how much interest has not just kind of continued with DeFi, but also grown within DeFi since the chaos of March 12th and everything that went down with Maker. I really didn't think Maker was going to be able to bounce back, and I know they're kind of having some issues, but now that you start to see a lot of your more sophisticated crypto traders and investors messing around with DeFi, I think it's only a matter of time before that continues to expand out past just your crypto community. I think it'll start with some of your more centralized products that have a much larger marketing budget and are quote unquote safer to kind of folks who aren't used to the crypto scene. But if you can if you can put your money into a stable coin that generates 7 or 8 or 9% yield, that's a really great way to introduce people to kind of this alternative financial landscape. And for those who continue past that, I think DeFi is is a really easy step. So it's interesting. I mean, we've talked about this a lot in the Layer One Live episodes that we do on Monday, but ETH has done so much since 2017, 2018 that they seem, at least to us, so far ahead versus a lot of these other protocols that I think at some point, no matter what they do, it's going to do well. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm super interested in how DeFi is related to DAOs and kind of what Moloch DAO has done, as well as Metacartel DAO, and how decentralized finance works its way into kind of like these liquidity pools that can be socialized among many people. I like that idea of kind of engaging communities through DAOs. So yeah, those are our two answers there, Devin.
Awesome.
But we've got a book recommendation. This is the last kind of question we have for you. Any type of book, it doesn't have to be crypto related, can be nonfiction, fiction. Any book recommendation you have for the viewers or listeners out there, and then we'll head off.
That's a good one. Yeah, I have a lot. I'm trying to figure out which one to choose. The one I recently read, which I guess probably a lot of people have already read. So I feel a little bit late to the game, but Principles by Ray Dalio. One of my favorite books I've read in the last while. Another good one.
Yeah, Principles is a good one. I haven't gotten there yet, but I think we've probably had people mention that a few times on the podcast now.
Yeah. Let me look through my Audible. The other one, this was kind of off the wall, but I Am a Strange Loop. Have you guys heard of that?
Mm-mm.
Really interesting book, kind of not at all crypto related or even business related, but it's sort of on like how we see ourselves, how like what does it mean to be a human being and kind of have some self-awareness. It's pretty interesting.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds like a good kind of off topic, heady book to dive into in quarantine. So yeah, definitely appreciate that. We'll take a look there at Open Loop. But you said OpenSea.io is a place to check out the marketplace. Where can folks find you? Are you on Twitter, or what's the best way to get in touch?
Yep. Twitter, my handle is dfinzer, DFINZER.
Beautiful.
And then our
Awesome.
OpenSea Twitter is OpenSea.
Easy enough. Some people, it's open_C 1 2 3 4. It's tough to remember. So props to you there.
Yeah, we'd be remiss without talking about your Discord as well. You have a really cool Discord community going on within OpenSea. Yeah. So definitely to head on over. I'm sure you can find that at OpenSea.io. But hey, Devin, this has been a great interview. This has been a great topic and conversation around NFTs, Ethereum, everything that's going on within this industry. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey guys, we hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to check out Layer 1 on all the audio and video platforms listed in the description. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next week.